There is a moment in every collapsing system when the danger is no longer invisible, but still ignored. Not because people are stupid, not because they are blind, but because acknowledging the pattern would require accepting something far more disturbing than any single crisis. It would require accepting that collapse does not arrive as chaos first. It arrives as normal life. The streets are still full. The supermarkets are stocked. Elections still happen. Courts still operate. And yet, beneath that surface, the structure is already failing. History is brutally consistent on this point. The most dangerous period for any society is not when it is weak, poor, or openly unstable. It is when it is convinced of its permanence. Every major political collapse of the modern era followed the same psychological error, the belief that this can't happen here. France believed it in 1788. Russia believed it in 1916. Cuba believed it in 1957. Each of those societies was convinced that its institutions were too old, too powerful, too embedded to fall. And each of them collapsed with stunning speed. Not over centuries, not over generations, but in years, sometimes in months. The uncomfortable truth is that revolutions do not erupt out of nowhere. They follow a sequence. Predictable, measurable, and repeatable. A sequence so consistent that once you learn to recognize it, you stop asking if a society is heading toward upheaval. You start asking where it is in the cycle. This is not a theory. It is a pattern extracted from blood, famine, executions, and mass graves. And today, that pattern is not approaching the United States. It is unfolding inside it. To understand why, we need to strip away modern distractions and look at revolutions the way historians do, not as moral events, but as mechanical processes. A revolution is not a protest. It is not a riot. It is not even political change. A revolution is the total destruction of an existing order and its replacement with something fundamentally different, usually something more authoritarian, more violent, and less free than what existed before. Revolutions are not driven by poverty alone. Humanity has been poor for most of its existence. They are driven by expectations, specifically by the moment when a large portion of society becomes convinced that the system is no longer capable of delivering a future that matches their expectations. That is when the social contract breaks. And when peaceful reform is no longer believed to be possible, violent transformation becomes thinkable. John F. Kennedy understood this clearly when he warned that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. That wasn't rhetoric. It was historical observation. Let's begin with the first case, not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most instructive. France, on the eve of 1789, was not a failing state. It was the cultural, intellectual, and military center of Europe. Paris was the heart of global art and philosophy. French was the language of diplomacy. The monarchy had ruled for 8 centuries. From the outside, it looked eternal. Internally, it was rotting. The first stage of every modern revolution is extreme wealth inequality combined with visible privilege. In late 18th century France, society was divided into 3 legal classes. The clergy and nobility, roughly 1.5% of the population, controlled enormous wealth and paid little to no taxes. The remaining 98.5% carried the financial burden of the state. This alone did not cause revolution. What made it explosive was visibility. Peasants were starving while aristocrats hunted on their land. Bread consumed nearly all of a laborer's income. Versailles overflowed with luxury, while rural families couldn't eat. Inequality becomes revolutionary only when it feels insulting. That insult grows sharper when government incompetence enters the picture. Stage 2. France was effectively bankrupt. Years of war, including financial support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The state responded in the worst possible way by borrowing more, taxing the poor more heavily, and refusing to confront elite privilege. Reform was blocked by the very classes that benefited from the system. This dynamic appears again and again in history. When elites are asked to sacrifice to preserve stability, they almost always choose to defend privilege instead. That choice radicalizes the middle class. Stage 3. The French Revolution did not begin with peasants. It began with lawyers, merchants, writers, and professionals. People who were educated, politically aware, and deeply invested in the system. When these people concluded that reform was impossible, legitimacy collapsed. Once legitimacy collapses, institutions follow. Courts, churches, assemblies, all lose authority at once. That is stage 4, loss of faith in institutions. This stage is the point of no return. From here, organized revolutionary movements emerge, offering simple answers to complex problems. Stage 5. And once those movements gain mass support, the old government collapses rapidly. What follows is never the promised utopia. It is terror, purges, civil war, and eventually dictatorship. Stage 6. France executed 40,000 people in the name of virtue. Russia would execute millions in the name of equality. Cuba would trade corruption for authoritarianism that lasted decades. The specifics differ, the sequence does not. This cycle has repeated across ideologies, cultures, and centuries because it is not ideological. It is structural. And now we arrive at the uncomfortable question. If this pattern is real, and history strongly suggests that it is, then where does the United States stand today? Not rhetorically, not emotionally, structurally. To answer that honestly, we must examine the same stages without patriotism, without denial, and without comfort. That examination begins with wealth, and the numbers are worse than most people realize. To understand where the United States stands in the revolutionary cycle, we must do what history always demands. Compare structure, not slogans. Every society believes its problems are unique. History shows they almost never are. The second stage of the revolutionary cycle is not collapse. It is distortion. Specifically, the distortion of incentives between effort and reward. When people believe that hard work no longer leads to stability, that education no longer guarantees mobility, and that institutions no longer serve the public rather than themselves, the psychological foundation of society begins to crack. This is not an emotional reaction. It is a rational one. In the United States, this distortion has been building for decades. Since the early 1970s, productivity has continued to rise, but wages have largely stagnated for the majority of workers. This is not a political talking point. It is a documented economic fact. The economy produces more value than ever before, yet that value is increasingly concentrated at the top. In 1970, the average CEO earned roughly 30 times the pay of the average worker. Today, that number often exceeds 300 times. Meanwhile, the cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, education, has risen far faster than inflation. This creates a specific form of frustration that history recognizes immediately. People are not poor, they are trapped. They work longer hours, accumulate more credentials, and take on more debt, only to discover that the promised future keeps receding. This is precisely the condition that radicalizes societies, not desperation. Disillusionment. The third stage follows naturally, the erosion of trust in elites. In stable systems, elites are tolerated, even resented, as long as they are perceived as competent stewards. When elites are seen as self-serving, insulated from consequences, and disconnected from lived reality, tolerance turns into hostility. Again, this is not ideological, it is mechanical. Financial crises accelerate this process. The collapse of 2008 was a pivotal moment. Millions lost homes, savings, and livelihoods. Entire communities were hollowed out. Yet almost no senior financial executives faced meaningful consequences. Institutions were rescued, individuals were not. This created a moral rupture that has never healed. For the first time in generations, large segments of the population concluded that the system was not merely flawed, but rigged. Once that belief takes hold, legitimacy begins to decay. This leads directly to stage 4, institutional distrust. Courts, media, universities, legislatures, institutions that once served as stabilizers, become targets of suspicion. Importantly, this distrust is not uniform. Different groups distrust different institutions for different reasons, but the outcome is the same. No institution is trusted by a majority. This fragmentation is fatal to consensus. Without shared trust, disagreement becomes existential. Politics turns into identity warfare. Compromise becomes betrayal. At this stage, societies become vulnerable to simplified narratives. Complex problems are reduced to villains. Structural failures are personalized. Historical nuance is replaced by moral absolutism. This is not accidental. It is psychologically comforting. Revolutionary movements thrive not because they are correct, but because they are certain. They offer clarity in a world that feels increasingly incoherent. The United States is now deeply entrenched in this phase. Political polarization is no longer about policy differences. It is about incompatible realities. Each side consumes different information, trusts different authorities, and inhabits different moral universes. This is precisely the condition that precedes systemic rupture. Not civil war, yet, but normalization of hostility. The most dangerous misconception is that wealth and technology prevent revolution. History suggests the opposite. Advanced societies collapse faster because expectations are higher. When systems fail in poor societies, people endure. When systems fail in rich societies, people revolt. France collapsed not because it was backward, but because it was advanced and unequal. Russia collapsed not because it was weak, but because modernization outpaced political adaptation. The United States faces a similar imbalance. Technological progress has outstripped institutional reform. Economic complexity has increased faster than political legitimacy. This creates a vacuum, and vacuums do not remain empty. They are filled by movements that promise restoration, purity, or justice, often at the cost of pluralism. History shows that once a society reaches this point, outcomes narrow rapidly. Either institutions reform fast enough to restore legitimacy, or revolutionary dynamics take over. There is no third option. The question, then, is not whether the United States is exceptional. It is whether it is adaptive. In the next part, we will examine the most dangerous phase of the cycle, the moment when polarization hardens into revolutionary identity, and why societies at this stage consistently underestimate how quickly stability can vanish. Every revolutionary cycle has a phase that looks deceptively familiar. Daily life continues, institutions still function. Violence is sporadic, not systemic. And yet, something irreversible has already occurred. The society has begun to morally reorganize itself. This is the fifth stage of the cycle, the stage where identity replaces citizenship and moral certainty replaces law. At this point, people no longer ask whether the system is broken. They assume it is. The only remaining question becomes, who is to blame? History shows that this is the most psychologically intoxicating phase of collapse. Because blame is emotionally satisfying. It simplifies reality. It offers moral clarity. It turns frustration into righteousness. In pre-revolutionary France, blame fell on aristocrats, clergy, and enemies of the people. In revolutionary Russia, it fell on kulaks, bourgeois intellectuals, and counter-revolutionaries. In Cuba, it fell on landowners, professionals, and anyone associated with the old order. The pattern is unmistakable. Once a society accepts that its institutions are illegitimate, it stops protecting the people who operate within them. Judges become political actors. Journalists become propagandists. Academics become enemies or priests. Neutrality becomes impossible. In the United States, this transition is already underway, though it is rarely recognized as such. Public discourse increasingly frames disagreement not as difference of opinion, but as evidence of moral corruption. Political opponents are not wrong. They are dangerous. This shift is subtle but decisive. Once political disagreement is moralized, violence becomes thinkable, not immediately, but eventually. Because if the other side is evil, then harming them becomes a form of virtue. History is merciless on this point. Every revolution that descended into terror began with moral absolutism. The justification was always the same. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary measures. What follows is normalization of rule-breaking. Courts are bypassed for justice. Due process is ignored for safety. Rights are suspended temporarily. The word temporary appears in every revolutionary archive. It never means what it claims. Once exceptions are justified, they multiply. Once power is exercised without restraint, it attracts those who desire it most. This is the paradox of revolutionary movements. They begin by promising liberation. They end by empowering the ruthless. The United States is not immune to this dynamic. The belief that constitutional structure alone prevents collapse misunderstands history. France had constitutions, Russia had laws, Cuba had courts. None of them mattered once legitimacy evaporated. What matters is belief. When enough people believe the system deserves to fall, it will, regardless of how well it was designed. The most dangerous indicator is not violence. It is celebration of violence. When acts of destruction are excused, rationalized, or quietly applauded because they target the right people, the line has been crossed. At that point, society is no longer arguing about policy. It is rehearsing justification. This is where revolutions accelerate, because fear spreads faster than ideology. Moderates retreat. Extremes dominate. Silence becomes survival. And once silence becomes common, power shifts quickly. It is critical to understand that revolutionary collapse does not require a majority. It requires only a committed minority and a paralyzed center. History confirms this relentlessly. The French Revolution was driven by a fraction of the population. The Bolsheviks seized power with the support of a small, disciplined corps. What mattered was not numbers. It was resolve. In modern societies, the process is amplified by speed. Information travels instantly. Outrage scales globally. Narratives harden in hours, not years. This compresses the timeline. What once took decades can now unfold in a few election cycles. The United States is experiencing this compression. Trust collapses faster. Radicalization accelerates. Institutional response lags. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. Revolutionary movements thrive on momentum. Institutions thrive on procedure. Momentum beats procedure. Every time. The final misconception is that collapse announces itself. It does not. It feels like escalation, until it feels like inevitability. Then it happens all at once. In the final part, we will confront the most uncomfortable question of all. Is reversal still possible? And if so, what does history suggest actually works? Not in theory, but in practice. Every revolutionary cycle ends the same way. but not in the way people expect. It does not end with justice. It does not end with equality. It does not end with liberation. It ends with exhaustion. History is unambiguous on this point. After the violence, after the purges, after the rhetoric has consumed itself, societies do not emerge renewed. They emerge traumatized. What replaces the old order is never the dream that justified its destruction. It is a regime designed to prevent chaos from ever returning, even if that means extinguishing the freedoms that once defined the society. This is the final irony of revolution. The desire for fairness produces control. The desire for justice produces force. The desire for safety produces obedience, and the public accepts it, not because they are foolish, but because they are tired. France accepted an emperor. Russia accepted a totalitarian state. Cuba accepted permanent authority in exchange for stability, not because these outcomes were noble, but because chaos had become unbearable. This is why the final stage of the cycle is not collapse. It is consolidation. Power recenters itself, but it is no longer constrained by tradition, legitimacy, or trust. It is constrained only by force. The tragedy is that this outcome is almost never intended. Revolutionaries rarely seek tyranny. They seek correction. But history does not reward intention. It rewards organization. And the most organized actors in revolutionary environments are rarely the most ethical ones. They are the most ruthless, the most disciplined, the least sentimental. This is the point where many modern observers object. They argue that awareness changes outcomes, that education prevents repetition, that history, once understood, loses its power. History offers little evidence for this optimism. The French intellectuals knew Rome had fallen. The Russian reformers studied Europe. The Cuban elites were well-educated, worldly, and informed. Knowledge did not save them. What history does suggest is more modest and more demanding. Reversal is possible only before legitimacy collapses completely. Once institutions are universally distrusted, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially harder than destroying it. This is why timing matters more than ideology. Reform must occur while institutions are still believed to be reformable. Once people conclude that the system itself is illegitimate, reform becomes indistinguishable from delay. At that point, acceleration takes over. The United States still retains one advantage. History rarely grants: time. But time is not infinite. Every unresolved contradiction compounds. Every deferred reform radicalizes. Every moralized conflict narrows the range of outcomes. The lesson of the revolutionary cycle is not that collapse is guaranteed. It is that delay is not neutral. Stability is not preserved by denial. It is preserved by adaptation. Adaptation, however, is uncomfortable. It requires elites to surrender privilege voluntarily. It requires institutions to accept accountability. It requires societies to tolerate complexity rather than demand purity. These are not popular demands. They never have been. Which is why revolutions remain more common than successful reform. History does not care about virtue. It cares about structure, and structures respond only to pressure. This is the final, sobering truth. The cycle does not ask whether a nation is moral. It does not ask whether its intentions are good. It does not ask whether it believes itself exceptional. It asks only whether its systems still function. When they do not, something else will replace them. Always. Understanding this is not an act of cynicism. It is an act of responsibility. Because societies that recognize the pattern early still have choices. Those that recognize it late have only consequences. If you've followed this entire analysis, you've done something rare. You've resisted the comfort of outrage. You've tolerated uncertainty. You've allowed history to remain complex. That matters, not because it makes you right, but because it makes you prepared. If this perspective added clarity rather than comfort, consider acknowledging it quietly. A thoughtful comment doesn't just help this video, it signals that serious discussion still has a place. A measured endorsement helps ideas like this reach people who value understanding over affirmation. And if there is one person you trust enough to disagree with, someone whose mind sharpens yours rather than mirrors it, sharing this video may lead to a conversation worth having. Those conversations are how societies change course, not through slogans, but through understanding.